Hello and welcome to another in our series from Grace Church, Handsworth, leading up to Easter, and our subject is the day the world changed. And we're basing our talks around the very early saying of Paul found in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 to 4, that Christ died for our sins just as the scriptures said. He was buried and that he was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the scriptures said. Now, we have said that this momentous day that changed the world did not just happen by accident, but was part of the plan and purpose of God. And it was predicted long before in the scriptures we find in the Old Testament. So I think we've come to the stage where we can actually look at some of the scriptures that Paul and the early church were probably thinking of. Now, if you look through the letters of the New Testament, the letters of Paul and Peter and other letters, and through the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, you'll find a lot of scriptures that are quoted or at least referred to concerning the death of the Messiah. Now, it's quite obvious the only scriptures the church had in mind were the Jewish scriptures, and of course we must make it clear that they were the scriptures found in what we now call the Old Testament. The New Testament was still being acted out and written by these disciples. So what were the scriptures perhaps that Paul had in mind? And now I'm just picking out a couple which were doubtless in the minds of the early church. And one would obviously be from Isaiah 52 to 53. Now, the prophet Isaiah, if you read chapters 40 to 55, it is a long poem telling of God's rescue of his people Israel from exile. But it also goes far beyond that, telling of the rescue of the world from the ultimate exile, of the ultimate problem, which is sin. And four passages in Isaiah 40 to 55 are often identified as the servant songs, because they focus on the call and work of the person called the Lord's servant or God's servant. And they are chapter 42 verses 1 to 4, chapter 49 verses 1 to 6, chapter 50 verses 4 to 9, and chapter 52 verses 13 to 53 verse 12. And they begin in chapter 42 verse 1, which says, "Look, my servant, whom I strengthen. He is my chosen one who pleases me. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring justice to the nations." And these songs or poems describe the servant as the one God has chosen to bring justice to the nations and to lead back the people of Israel to God. But that servant will also be a light, so that other nations will recognize God's saving power. Unlike others in the Jewish scriptures who are called the Lord's servant, for example, Abraham, Jacob, and Moses, the servant of Isaiah suffers physical pain and humiliation. We see it in chapter 50, verse 6, chapter 52, verse 14, and chapter 53, 3 to 5, and verse 7. And he suffers pain and humiliation in the work the Lord has called him to do. And the last and best known of these songs is, of course, in chapters 52 to 53, where the prophet recognizes that the suffering of the servant will help accomplish the work he was called to do. In other words, his own suffering will ultimately take away the sins and guilt of others, and the Lord will reward the servant for sacrificing his life for others. Now, as the early followers of Jesus read the servant songs, they clearly connected the servant with Jesus the Messiah. For example, Matthew states that the predictions of Isaiah 42, 1 to 4 were fulfilled in the life and work of Jesus. You can see this in Matthew 12, verses 18 to 21. And similarly, the evangelist Philip explains to an Ethiopian official that the words of Isaiah 53:7-8 referred to Jesus. And read the story in Acts chapter 8, verses 26-35, where Philip goes into the chariot and finds the Ethiopian reading this particular passage, and it says Philip preached Christ to him. Jesus himself identifies himself as the servant who will give his life to rescue many people in Mark 10 verse 45, and he offers his work as a model of servanthood for his followers to imitate. So let's have a look at some of that last servant song and how it tells of the Messiah as the servant of the Lord. And it says, "See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised up and lifted up and highly exalted." That's Isaiah 53 verse 13. And then it tells of the sufferings of the Messiah in the next verse, verse 14. "But many were amazed when they saw him. His face was so disfigured, he seemed hardly human. And from his appearance one would scarcely know that he was a man." Foreseeing Jesus' horrendous beatings that he suffered at the hands of the authorities. And tells then of his rejection. Chapter 53 verse 3. "He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with the deepest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care." And then the reason behind it, that he bore our sins away. Yet the prophet says, "It was our weakness he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down." And we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins. Yes, they thought, when they took Jesus away, they were punishing him for his own sins of claiming he was God. But the prophet goes on, "He was pierced for our rebellion. He was crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us like sheep have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own way. Yet the Lord has laid on him the sins of us all." And that's Isaiah 53 verses 4-6. So we see Isaiah prophesies that although people thought the Messiah was being punished for his own sins when they cruelly whipped and nailed him to the cross, it was really our sins he was bearing. The nails were driven into the hands of Jesus because of our rebellion. The weight of the cross was bearing the weight of our sins. He was beaten and his body torn apart so we could be made whole. And with his wounds we are healed. The prophet says we have all behaved like lost sheep in the sight of God, going our own way. That's what sin is, going our own way. But the Lord has laid on Jesus, the Messiah, the sins of us all so we would not have to bear the penalty of them. But Isaiah tells us that the suffering of the Messiah is all in the plan of God. Verse 10 of chapter 53, "Yet it was the Lord's good plan to crush him and cause him grief. Yet when his life is made an offering for sin, he will have many descendants. He will enjoy a long life, and the Lord's good plan will prosper in his hands." Why? Well, to gather a people to himself by making an offering for their sin. Therefore God will raise him from the dead, and he will of course have many descendants, which is of course the church of Jesus Christ. And then verse 11 of chapter 53, "When he sees all that is accomplished by his anguish, he will be satisfied. And because of his experience, my righteous servant will make it possible for many to be counted righteous, for he will bear all their sins." Jesus has borne the sins of all who will believe in him. When we believe, we are counted righteous. we enter the covenant. We enter the family of God in the new covenant. Now, of course, we could quote from many other Old Testament scriptures, but let's just take one more from Psalm 118, verse 22. The stone that the builders rejected has now become the cornerstone. This was quoted by Jesus himself and taken up by other New Testament writers. Although Jesus was rejected by the Jewish leaders and handed over to be crucified, God has made him the foundation stone in the new kingdom he is building on earth, which is known, of course, as the church. And Paul takes this up in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20. Together we are God's house, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, and the cornerstone is the Messiah, Jesus himself. You see, we become a member of God's new house by believing in the work of the Messiah, Jesus, and in the work he's done to heal us on the cross that first Good Friday, when he died for our sins according to the scriptures. Jesus, the Messiah, was wounded so we could be healed. That was the day the world changed. By believing it, we can be changed too.